what is their job? Well, they're going to land in 6 Horsa gliders at around midnight and capture by coup de main, that's a kind of storm attack, these 2 bridges. The possession is vital, as I've already mentioned, not only to defend the eastern flank of the D-Day beachhead from a German counterattack, but also to allow an Allied breakout once the landings were secure. On the outcome of this single mission, I would argue, does the success or failure of the whole Normandy invasion depend.
Hello. Late on the night of the 5th of June 1944, 6 gliders coasted towards their targets. Key bridges whose capture meant success or failure for the Allies on D-Day. Saul David returns to discuss this key operation when Major John Howard of the Parachute Brigade led one of the most stunning successes of the Second World War. This is part 1 of a couple of pods commemorating D-Day, which took place 80 years ago. Saul's new book, Sky Warriors, has just been published and is already a Sunday Times bestseller. I've put links in the show notes, including maps, so you can get to grips on locations and other things like that. Plenty more great history to come, including next week, part 2, as I chat with Gordon Corrigan and Philip Blood on D-Day, as the 2 historians represent the Allies and Germans respectively. If you can give me a gentle review, I'd be hugely grateful. And please do share the pod, but until then I'll hand you over to D-Day, Pegasus Bridge, and the Sky Warriors with Saul. Saul David, welcome back. Great to have you back on, Saul.
Thanks, Ollie. Very nice to be invited.
Well, of course, Saul, because particularly we're here to talk about your new book, and it's always great to get a new Saul David book. And this one is Sky Warriors, British Airborne Forces in the Second World War. And it's come out at a perfect time because this episode will be released for the anniversary of D-Day. And a key component of the British forces on D-Day was the airborne operations, which may be familiar to some, certainly is to me, through probably most famously the Longest Day. But this is involving the 6th Airborne Division, whereas, just full disclosure, Saul, full disclosure, we had Mark Urban on about 18 months ago talking about, I think, the 1st Airborne Division. So this is separate. Mm-hmm. This is the 6th Airborne Division. And the first weren't involved in D-Day, I don't think, but the 6th.
That's right.
Yeah, so the 6th, this is Pegasus Bridge. This is a key, I guess you can expand a little bit more, but you were just telling me before we started recording, the 6th Airborne Division, this was their first action, first ever time that they fought in anger. Is that right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's funny, if you go back right to the beginning, when Churchill asks on the 5th of June for the raising of 5,000 parachutists, he's been inspired partly by German airborne who've done quite well in the Low Countries and the campaign prior to Dunkirk. But he's also looking for a way to strike back against the enemy. I mean, remember, this is post-Dunkirk, so things are looking pretty grim for Britain, and this is the time which he asked for the raising of the so-called hunter class, and these become the commandos. But he wants at least one of the commandos, 500 strong, to be parachute trained, and eventually to expand out into a force that's 5,000 strong. But it does take quite a long time, and the story of 6th Airborne is interesting because you get the 1st Parachute Brigade doesn't come into existence until the end of 1941, and that later expands into the 1st Airborne Division. And then shortly after that, you get the initial components that are going to be part of the 6th Airborne Division. There is no 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, in case you're wondering, Ollie. The 1st and 6th were the only 2 British airborne divisions of the war. They did intend to raise a 3rd, which would have been the 44th Indian Airborne Division, which was created in name, but never actually went into action as a whole division. I mean, components of it did fight, and I've got bits of that in the book. But the story of 6th Airborne Division's first action is at D-Day, and it's pretty remarkable, actually, as I'm going to explain in a moment what happened. It's remarkable that it does so well, and that it's actually trusted, frankly, for this really key component of the whole airborne Operation Overlord plan.
The 1st had been involved in a number of operations in Italy. Were they exhausted? Was there always a plan to use the 6th? Was it a kind of carefully constructed strategy.
No, that wasn't necessarily the case. And the 1st Airborne Division were very put out, I have to say, when they weren't chosen to do anything at D-Day. And of course, they will come back into the story, as I'm sure some of your listeners know, Ollie, as no doubt you discussed with Mark, for the Market Garden Plan, which was 1st Airborne. But I think the reason 6th is chosen is because it's fully intact, it's trained up, it's raring to go. And the 1st Airborne Division, or at least components of it, including the famous 1st Parachute Brigade, which first goes into action in North Africa in late 1942, but also fights in Sicily and Italy, as you mentioned, Ollie. It's pretty much worn out by this point. In fact, it's taken very heavy casualties. The 1st Parachute Brigade in North Africa, and a lot of the originals, the highly trained originals, have been frittered away. So 6th Airborne is seen as intact. It's highly motivated, and it's also fortunate in its commander, a man called Windy Gale. That was his nickname, Richard Gale. A very big man, kind of taciturn, but a real fire eater. And Gale was one of the finest airborne commanders of the war. He'd commanded the original 1st Parachute Brigade, and then had been, effectively given a staff job and sent back to the UK. And later takes over 6th Airborne. So they've got one of the best people in charge. One of the great controversies about Market Garden, I should say as a quick aside, is that the man in charge is Urquhart, who is not an airborne commander. He's been sort of, moved across from infantry. And certainly a lot of the more experienced airborne officers in the 1st Airborne Division felt that it was a bad appointment, that you really needed an airborne specialist. Well, Gale was an airborne specialist, and it's at least partly down to him that the airborne troops fight so well at D-Day.
Well, I can see you're sharpening your knife for Urquhart. For when listeners will be talking to Saul in September for the anniversary of Market Garden, but it sounds like Urquhart's not going to come out of that very well. But just moving back to D-Day, how about his battalion commanders then? So you've got Gale. He's this experienced and the perfect man for the task, really. How about his officers reporting into him, the colonels and majors, I assume?
Yeah, you've got some very good people. I mean, the guy command. So you in an airborne division, you've got 2 parachute brigades and 1 air landing brigade. Air landing really is brought in by glider, and the others come in by parachute. So it's 2/3 to 1/3 parachutists, but in charge of the parachute brigades, you've got 2 pretty experienced characters, and one in particular who's arguably one of the finest airborne commanders of the Second World War. So you've got Gale at the top. The 6th Airborne Division was very fortunate, Ollie, in having some of the most experienced brigade commanders. So in effect, you've got 2 parachute brigades, the 3rd and 5th Parachute Brigade, and you've got an air landing brigade, the 6th. The 6th Air Landing Brigade was commanded by Kindersley. He was a decent officer, but I think the single best brigade commander was a man called James Hill, who was actually wounded quite early on in the North African campaign. But you can see he's been there since 1942. And what they do with 6th Airborne Division to stiffen them is that they bring over quite a few guys who had originally fought in the 1st Parachute Brigade. So you've got Hill there. You've got another man called Pearson, who takes over 1st Parachute Battalion after Hill is injured. And you've also got a brilliantly named character called Pine Coffin, who features very largely in the most famous action during D-Day, and that's the defense of Pegasus Bridge, because he commands the 7th Parachute Battalion and commands it very well during the defense of the bridge. So you can see that although in the whole division hasn't seen action before, a number of the key officers have been transferred from 1st Airborne Division, with the specific reason of giving it a little bit of experience.
And are the men of the division, are they picked up from other regiments around the British Army because they volunteered for it? It was they're paid a little bit better, aren't they, in the Airborne Division? And
yeah, they're all volunteers. Every now and again, a whole battalion gets transferred for parachute duties, but rarely does the whole battalion get taken on. You usually, I mean, a very good example is Pine Coffin's battalion at D-Day. That's the 9th Parachute Battalion. Well, that was originally an infantry battalion of the Essex Regiment, and when it was turned into parachute capability, only about 200 of the original 800 or 900 strong were kept, and the rest were all volunteers. All of them have to be parachute trained. They are given a financial inducement. That's another 2 shillings, which was, quite welcome. The air landing troops, by the way, only had 1 shilling extra, and they were pretty miffed with that. Danger money. And frankly, if you ask me, Ollie, would I prefer to go into battle by parachute as opposed to glider? I mean, I think they're both equally dangerous, as we're about to discover when we discuss some of the actions on D-Day. So why they only got 1 shilling is beyond me. But in any case, that was a small financial inducement. But the most important thing to say about all airborne is that they're light infantry, they're strike troops. They rarely have the firepower backup of a normal infantry division. Therefore, their job can never be for any length of time. Their task is to go in, capture something, and then be relieved by ground troops advancing towards them. If you leave them for too long, which of course happens at Arnhem, you've got trouble on your hands. But they're very aggressive, they're very capable, they're light infantry in effect, par excellence. They're trained to a very high pitch in both marksmanship and fitness. But as I say, they're a one-shot weapon, and you can't leave them out in the field for too long.
And what you mentioned weapon, what are they carrying? Are they all got Sten guns, or is it Lee Enfield rifles?
Well, it's a mixture. Most of them have got Lee Enfields and Brens, so they're armed with the typical infantry kit, but also the normal grenades. They've got 1 or 2 you might call specialist weapons, and one of them, of course, is the Sten gun, which is very light, robust, easy to fire, but only accurate at very close quarters, which is fine if you're airborne troops and you're fighting at close quarters. They also have Piats, which come into the story of D-Day. The Piat is effectively, an anti-tank weapon fired from the shoulder. It's a kind of rocket fire, a bit like the American bazooka, I suppose you would describe it. But again, only really effective at relatively short ranges. Takes quite a long time to reload too. So, if you miss with a Piat, you're in big trouble, which again is one of the kind of dramatic moments of the D-Day landings.
They seem to have a strong reputation, the Piat, but I always thought it looked a bit crap, actually.
Yeah, me too. And when you read the accounts of how to fire it, and as I say, how difficult it was to load, it's incredibly slow, laborious business about piecing it together. A couple of the Piats actually that landed with the gliders at Pegasus Bridge got broken in the landing. So that'll give you an indication of the kind of violence of landing in a glider on the one hand, but it'll also tell you that they weren't the most robust built, as you can see when you have a look at one of them. But they were actually quite effective if used by experienced soldiers. And there is, as I say, one famous moment, which really is a turning point in the battle for Pegasus Bridge, in which a Piat is deployed.
Okay, well let's do it. Let's do the night of. It starts. The operation starts just before midnight on the 5th. Late at night on the 5th of June. And so how many gliders are we talking, and how many are parachuting?
Well, just to give the big picture first, the job of British Airborne at D-Day, Operation Tonga, as it was known, and that's a component of Operation Overlord, is to protect the eastern flank of the D-Day beachhead. So they're going to drop them before any of the landings the following morning, and they are going to secure bridges and high ground and rivers that will prevent the Germans from counterattacking the flank of the beachhead. The Americans, by the way, 2 American airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, are going to do exactly the same with the western flank. But the reason the British job is even more important is it's the open flank. If you think about it, if you look at the position of Normandy, the open flank is the bit with all of France facing it, whereas the western flank, which the Americans had to secure, only really gave access to immediately Cherbourg and some of the other parts of the Cotentin Peninsula, as it was known. So the really dangerous bit, the bit that all these SS Panzer divisions, which are being kept back as a kind of strategic reserve, they can get to the beaches by the quickest route going towards the eastern flank. So this is the flank the British have to control. They are going to use about 8,500 men to do it. That's mainly paratroopers, but also glider-borne infantry. And there are 4 key objectives the 6th Airborne Division has that day. The single most important one is the one we've already been referring to. That's to hold 2 road bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. Now, those road bridges are effectively going to protect the flank of Sword Beach, which is the most easterly of the 5 landing beaches. And that's the job that's given to D Company of the 2nd Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, and I'm sure we'll come on to that story in a minute. There's also another important job, which is the role of the 9th Parachute Battalion, and that's to neutralize an enemy artillery battery at Merville near the coast. The broader job of the whole of the 6th Airborne, particularly the 3rd and 5th Parachute Brigades, is to secure a bridgehead between those two bridges I've already mentioned. That's the Caen Canal and the Orne River, and the Dives River. So it's between the rivers Orne and Dives, and that bridgehead will prevent, as I've already mentioned, enemy reinforcements, including panzer units, from moving towards the British left flank from the east and the southeast. But the single most important job, in my opinion, and I think in most historians' opinion, Ollie, is the task given to those 100 sappers, that's engineers, but mostly infantrymen of Major John Howard's D Company, 2nd Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, which was part of, as I mentioned before, the 6th Air Landing Brigade. What is their job? Well, they're going to land in 6 Horsa gliders at around midnight and capture by coup de main, that's a kind of storm attack, these 2 bridges. The possession is vital, as I've already mentioned, not only to defend the eastern flank of the D-Day beachhead from a German counterattack, but also to allow an Allied breakout once the landings were secure. On the outcome of this single mission, I would argue, does the success or failure of the whole Normandy invasion depend.
Wow, you can't get more significant than that. That's fascinating. So, right, the British have got the hard bit. The Americans are dealing with the easy stuff. It's probably fair to say.
They won't want to hear
think is
that.
what you're saying there, Saul.
Yeah, they
Americans,
won't want to hear
please
that.
do get in touch. History at aspectsofhistory.com. You've just mentioned this. They're air landing, which means they're gliders. So why choose to land in a glider? I'm sounding like an idiot here, but I assume a socking great glider or a few, is it 3 of them, I think, was it?
Yeah, three per bridge. So I mentioned those 2 bridges that are the task of Major John Howard's group. I need to say a little bit about Howard in a second, but just to also give you an idea of a glider. I mean, it's just a nuts bit of kit
Plywood,
to go to
isn't
war
it?
in, Ollie. It's made of plywood and steel, 67 feet in length, with a wingspan of 88 feet, and it's described by one of the occupants during the actions in the Second World War as looking like the inside of a tube train, and you're effectively crash landing into war. So why would you do it? Well, 2 reasons. You can get an awful lot of blokes, that's up to 30 blokes in a single glider at a single location. If you try dropping anyone by parachute, they get blown all over the place. And that's exactly what happened at D-Day. It was, of the battalion that was coming in to relieve John Howard's company, that's the 7th Parachute Battalion, as I already mentioned, which was commanded by Pine Coffin. Only a quarter of them actually get to the rendezvous point. So that tells you how completely chaotic it is and how difficult it is to actually land people. But remember, this is a night action. And if we compare it to Arnhem, for example, they land by day there, and they find it much more easy to coalesce together and to get everyone in the right place in the right time, because they're dropping them by day and everyone can see what's going on. But at night, it's incredibly difficult. So you land a glider, and what you risk in people getting injured in the crash, you get an advantage of the fact that they're all together. And if you land them right next to the bridge, which is exactly what happens at Pegasus Bridge, it's a very quick job to actually capture the bridge itself. Capturing it is one thing, and defending it is another, of course. You've then got a separate problem at your hands. But the initial job is to capture the bridges before the Germans have a chance to blow them up, because all these bridges, for obvious reasons, have been prepared with explosives. And the question is, will the Germans have enough warning and allow them to blow the bridges before they can actually storm them and capture them?
So they land just before we get to the actual storming of the bridge. When they land, were the senior commanders, they accepted a level of loss amongst gliders? So I mean, there must have been gliders where they crashed so horrifically, pretty much everyone inside was either killed or seriously wounded. That was a risk. Those numbers they were willing to absorb, made up for by the action at Pegasus, where the glider lands so close and makes the storming of the bridge a lot easier.
Exactly. And you would be perfectly justified to ask, well, why on earth is anyone going to agree to go to war in a glider if those are the risks? But it's extraordinary that people who do go into these special units, and the paratroopers I would include in that, are those sort of risk-taking characters, and they're also quite young, and they don't really, have a kind of sense of their own mortality. But just as I mentioned before, I do think it's pretty remarkable, the guy who leads this action at Pegasus Bridge, because he's quite unusual for army officers in the Second World War. He was, as I say, a guy called Major John Howard, but he came from an incredibly modest background. He's born in a two up, two down in Camden, North London, at a time when Camden was not the most salubrious place in the world. He was the eldest of 9 children, and he left school at 14 and really was, destined for a career as a clerk, a kind of, minor white collar at best. But war broke out. He'd already got a little bit of training as a police sergeant. He then joins up as a regular ordinary soldier, gets promoted up through the ranks to sergeant major, and is eventually offered a commission. But he's commissioned into quite a snooty regiment, the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, famous from the Napoleonic Wars, the light infantry, and they've done great stuff. Later on became part of the Royal Green Jackets. And I know that as the son of a military family, you'll know a bit of the distinction of what I'm talking about here, Ollie. And when John Howard pitches up as a young officer in the Ox and Bucks, the rest of the guys who were there, who all came from upper middle class minimum backgrounds, weren't terribly impressed. And, they looked down on him to a certain extent. And it's partly because he was looked down on that he was determined to be the best company commander that he could be. And he not only, set himself high standards, he set his whole company high standards. And as a result of this, I don't think there's any question, he actually produced what was the finest company in the whole of the Air Landing Brigade in terms of its standard of training, fitness, marksmanship, and everything else. And as a result, he was given this single most important job on D-Day. So it was partly because of his background that he was so driven and so determined to be the best he could be.
Yeah, well, inevitably, he sounds like the inspiration for Bernard Cornwell's Sharp.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I never made that connection before. Next time I see Bernard Cornwell, I hope I'll get the chance to see him. Yeah, he's getting on a little bit now, isn't he? And I gather when I last spoke to Richard Foreman, who knows him quite well, that he hasn't been terribly well. But I'd love to ask him that question of whether he's aware of that story. I mean, Bernard, of course, has written non-fiction about very well too, about the Battle of Waterloo. I'm not sure he's taken such an interest in the Second World War, so who knows? But it is remarkable how similar the backgrounds were from the two of them, certainly from a social background.
Yeah, and there is one officer actually who we should mention who is in this operation at Pegasus Bridge, I think. Lieutenant Richard Todd, who
Yes,
plays Major Howard in the subsequent depiction of those events in The Longest Day.
you couldn't make it up. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant story. And of course, I play on this quite a lot in the book. So Todd at the time is he goes on to become a great matinee idol, but at the time he's really just working in rep up in Scotland, I think, actually, just before the war. So he's not a well-known actor. And he volunteers for the Paras like everyone did because he wanted to see some action. And incredibly, he plays a really prominent role in the story of Pegasus Bridge, but also writes it up afterwards. So there's a really good account of what he did that day. And as you say, Ollie, bizarrely, I mean, he could have been asked to play himself. Obviously, he'd have been a little bit older by the time the Longest Day is made. But instead, he's given the single most important role in terms of characters, and that's to play Howard. So it's an absolutely brilliant story. I mean, Todd did come, I have to say, from a more typical officer middle class background, so he didn't entirely fit the Howard mold in that sense. And I can't remember from The Longest Day whether he actually puts on a bit of a a kind of Londoner accent or not. But yeah, it is a bizarre coincidence, isn't it, that he was actually there and fought at Pegasus Bridge, but is not playing a 7 para. He's playing Howard himself.
Well, I'll have to watch it again to check. I actually met Richard Todd at my godfather's funeral, and he was a
Wow.
lovely man, lovely man. But we digress. So we haven't really got to the actual landing of the gliders. So the gliders do land, 3 of them per bridge, but we're going to talk Pegasus Bridge really now, aren't we? So that's
Yeah. So to to orientate the listener, these two bridges are a quarter of a mile apart. The one that's closest to the beachhead, that Sword Beach, is the Caen Canal Bridge, and that's the one that's known to history as Pegasus Bridge. The other one is the Orne River Bridge, and that was a quarter of a mile away. Three gliders are tasked with capturing each bridge. They actually approach from opposite directions, Ollie, for the very good reason that there's less chance of them all colliding with each other as they land, and they can all land simultaneously, if you see what I mean. So one's coming in from the north and one's coming in from the south, or one group is coming in from the north and one from the south. Let's stick with Howard's lot first. Well, he's in glider number one, and that's just typical of the man. He never ask his guys to do anything he's not prepared to do himself. He's right there at the beginning. He's going to control the operation from the word go. The glider lands with a hell of a smash. It's almost smashed to pieces. Both of the pilots are temporarily knocked out. I mean, everyone's in a bit of a bad way, and even Howard himself is briefly knocked unconscious. He opens his eyes and he can't see anything, and that's because his bowler helmet, these helmets that the paras use, is actually come over on front of his eyes. So as soon as he pushes that up, he's back in business. He breaks his way out of the shattered glider, immediately grabs hold of his platoon commander, who's been given the job of capturing the bridge, and says, get cracking. So Brotheridge, who also comes from a relatively modest background, has been handpicked by Howard. He actually comes from Birmingham. Brotheridge shouts to his guys, "Come on, lads." And they just go straight across the bridge. So it's quite a clever plan. One section is to go straight across the bridge and ignore the inner defense. The second section is to take out the inner defense. And the third section, well, it goes wherever it's needed. And the same goes with the other two platoons. So the key thing is you've got to capture both sides of the bridge immediately, which again, if I'm going to make a comparison, you will notice does not happen at Arnhem. I know it's a more difficult task, and there was a plan to get half of them over and to capture the bridge from the southern end as well, but they never actually manage it. But they do at Pegasus, and it makes all the difference. And within a very short period of time, and with relatively few casualties at this early stages, even though there's been a lot of firing as they're running over the bridge, but basically they drive the defenders away. They kill some of them, and the others do a runner. So within a really short period of time, apart from two fatalities, one of whom is sadly Den Brotheridge, the platoon commander, who's been shot in the throat and mortally wounded, and another guy, and this gives you an idea of the kind of risk of landing in a glider. He was knocked unconscious when glider number 3 landed and drowns because it lands in a pond. So that's the other serious casualty. Now, move over to the other bridge. So they've captured the bridge in a very short period of time. If you move over to the Orne River Bridge, only 2 of the 3 gliders land there. And that's, as I say, about a quarter of a mile away. But there was relatively little opposition compared to at the Caen Canal Bridge, which was seen by the Germans too as the more important of the two. And even the reduced force is able to capture that bridge after destroying a machine gun post with a mortar. So within 10 minutes, Ollie, so if they land at 12:15 on D-Day, 6th of June, Tuesday, 6th of June, within 10 minutes, Howard's men have captured both bridges, and they put out the call sign to, signal that success, ham and jam.
Right. So that's a huge success. Relatively few casualties, but you mentioned that Howard's objective was defended a little bit stronger by the Germans. But surely, if we knew that bridge was so important, surely the Germans knew that as well.
Well, the problem for the Germans is that there were an awful lot of places they were having to guard. So yes, of those 2 bridges, it was seen as more significant, but it was only going to be significant if they'd known they were coming to those beaches, which of course they did not, Ollie. So they're having to defend an enormous number of bridges all the way up to the Pas de Calais, and certainly Hitler and the senior commanders, Rommel too, were convinced, even up to the last moment, that it was much more likely the landings would be in the Pas de Calais. So that's really the point there. Of course, if they'd known that D-Day was going to be at that location in Normandy, they would have had a lot more troops there, but they didn't know that. So it was reasonably strongly defended. But I think the key strategy, as far as the Germans were concerned and Rommel was concerned, was counterattacking as quickly as possible. But this is where the real weakness of their strategy came into play, because it all depended how close your reactive forces were to the beachhead. Basically, guarding most of the coast were second-grade troops. You had the front line troops, including the 21st Panzer Division, which is quite relatively close to the location we're talking about. They are going to be in a position to counterattack, but there's been all this confusion with orders, and they don't actually get the order to counterattack and try and retake those bridges and to counterattack the beachhead until 8 a.m. on D-Day. And that is a crucial kind of time lag at which it's given the, the airborne forces, but also the other forces landing a chance at least to get a bit of a foothold.
So does that mean, therefore, then that Howard's force is relatively unmolested throughout the night?
No, it actually doesn't mean that. I mean, first of all, you've got the reaction from the troops who are based in the area. So you've got the immediate garrison, that was about 50, and they get overrun quite quickly. But you also got reserves not far away, a battalion of Panzer Jaegers, so they're not insignificant Panzer Hunter troops with armored cars. Then advance relatively quickly on the bridge. So only within an hour of them landing is the counterattack put in, and this is the point at which the pier action takes place, because the only anti-tank weapon they've got at the time to fight against armored cars and tanks is the pier. It fires a 2.5-pound projectile which is capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor, but it only has, as I said, an effective range of 50 yards. So it's a one-shot weapon, and if you miss, they're going to be overrun. And the actual guy who fires at this column of German armored vehicles advancing on the bridge, which of course is impermeable, it's protected against machine gun fire and grenades and everything else they have there. So the only thing that can really take it out is a pier, is a man called Sergeant Charles Thornton. And Thornton's the guy who's been responsible for knocking out the Orne River Bridge. He's the one who fired the mortar that knocked out the machine gun post there. So he's already a hero of the night, and he's now got the job of taking out these armored cars which are advancing towards the bridge, and they've got some troops ahead of the bridge to defend it. And as Thornton puts it, he describes it, he's shaking like a leaf as he lines up his Piat sights on the lead vehicle, knowing he won't have time to reload. As I say, it's a one chance. Well, he fires when the leading black shape is about 30 yards away, and fortunately it's a hit. The armored half track, which it was, armed with a 20 millimeter, possibly a 30 millimeter gun, explodes with a mighty bang. It's actually quite lucky, because he sets off some ammunition inside the armored car and it gets blown to pieces. And the other bit of good fortune is that the commander of that unit that's heading towards the bridge is actually in that first armored car, and he gets killed. So the rest of them, thinking that the bridge is almost certainly being defended by at least 6-pounder anti-tank guns, which were very effective and used at Arnhem very effectively, they decide to withdraw. They actually should have carried on attacking, but they don't. They decide to withdraw, and this gives Pine Coffin's 7th Parachute Battalion enough time to reach the bridge.
Right. One thing I was always wanted to know, and this is the glider pilots who take the glider in. Once they've landed the glider, or the glider has landed itself, what do they then do? Is it then they can sort of sit back and relax and their job's done? Or I guess in this operation, numbers are key.
Yeah, exactly. So as a result, all glider pilots, all members of the glider pilot regiment were trained to fight. So as soon as the glider is on the ground and everyone's got out of the glider, their job is to support whichever troops they brought in, and they are all trained to do that. And that's exactly what happens at Pegasus Bridge. Even though, as I've already mentioned, these 12 glider pilots, a lot of them are not in a great way because they're right at the front of the glider when it crash lands. The two guys on number 1 glider that brought in Howard and number 1 platoon are, as I say, not in great nick immediately, but they recover and are then used to carry ammunition, to carry pier ammunition and various things from the glider to the guys defending the bridge, over the bridge to the people defending the front lines. So they do play a really important role, and you see this in all the actions in which gliders take place, including of course Arnhem, where an awful lot of gliders come in. Some of them you do get the tragic situation, Ollie, as you suggested, where literally a whole glider, the occupants of a whole glider are wiped out. There's one particularly grim story, which is in my book, when they first used gliders properly in action in a brigade sense, a whole air landing brigade in the first air landing brigade, as it was known, in Sicily, and on in an attempt to capture a bridge there, very similar to the Pegasus bridge story. A whole glider, its ammunition explodes on landing. It's got some explosives with them, and it explodes, and every single person, that's up to 30 in the glider, is killed. So incredibly dangerous, risky thing to do. But the glider pilots, as I say, were designed to fight as infantry as soon as they were on the ground.
And I remember this as well from Cornelius Ryan's book as well. He's constantly in his head is hold until relieved, because he's
Yeah.
like he's almost internalizing in that sentence, in that line. He just feels this huge amount of responsibility on his shoulders, that if it doesn't go off, it's all down to him. Is that right? Do we know what was going through his mind throughout the
We do, because we've got an incredibly detailed account of him that was eventually put together by his daughter and published in I think about 2006, and it's really a combination of his writings and diaries and letters, and it's you get a wonderful sense of who he was and what he was thinking that night. And what he was thinking is, I've got enormous responsibility, because he is the spearhead of the whole Normandy invasion, the very first troops to land. And they've got the single most important job. So it's an unbelievable responsibility, which he carries out, with incredible determination and courage, and successfully. But his main task, as you say, is hold until relieved. And he's got to hold until the 7th Parachute Battalion get there, which they do at about 3 a.m. But 3 a.m. is already 90 minutes behind schedule. And as I think I mentioned before, Pine Coffin's battalion are now down to a quarter of their strength. So although technically he's going to be relieved at, it should have been 1:30, it's now 3 a.m. In reality, all of his guys have got to support the 7 Para, because the 7 Para have lost 3/4 of their strength. They're down to 150 blokes to defend this bridge. And although this initial attack doesn't succeed, the 21st Panzer Division does, later on that morning, while it's still dark, send in some of their best troops of Panzer Grenadiers, who fight ferociously for the bridge and the nearby village of Benouville, where 7 Para are holding out heroically, although they pay for their resistance, because when the Germans, who are obviously pretty frustrated at not retaking the bridge, overrun the 7 Para aid post, they kill all the wounded and the Padre, George Parry, who's there, helping with the wounded. I mean, it's an appalling war crime, which is not, it's interesting, because we always think of these war crimes as being carried out by SS troops, but these guys were just ordinary 21st Panzer Division, very famous from having fought in the desert, actually. And they come into my story of Tunesgrad, which I'm writing at the moment. And, you get none of these sorts of stories in the desert, but there's something about fighting in this desperate action for the defense of France that brings out the worst in these guys.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere that the Allies had hoped or assumed or expected a lot more desertions or resistance to be a lot weaker than it actually was. Is that right?
Well, I've read a lot of the original intelligence assessments for D-Day in relation to the airborne division. In other words, who are the type of troops we're likely to come up against? And they had some very good intelligence, and the general opinion was, as I mentioned before, this is going to be second and third rate troops. They've got a lot of non-Germans in them, Poles and people from other parts of occupied Europe, and they aren't going to fight particularly well. But what's interesting about the German army, I'm not saying that everyone was fully motivated, but if there were even a few pretty staunch NCOs, then it meant the others kept fighting, probably for fear of the consequences if they didn't. But certainly some of the other units, like the 21st Panzer Division, were very motivated. I mean, they were elite units that had famous battle histories. And you also had a lot of SS troops. So although the 21st weren't, there were a lot of SS troops who were fighting pretty fanatically and full of some pretty committed Nazis.
So they've resisted that attack. They've been reinforced. We're sort of in the middle of the night now, 3, 4 a.m. How long did they have to wait until? Because the idea is that you get the forces from the beaches coming in to relieve them. Is that right?
Yeah, and the key moment is at noon, where the famous arrival of the Commando Brigade. So the commandos are going to be the first off the beach, and they've got a single job: get to the Caen Canal Bridge. relieve the troops there. Well, not relieve the troops, but reinforce the troops. What actually happens is it's a psychological moment as much as anything else, because it means that the airborne bridgehead is linked up with the beaches. Okay, so that's an important moment. But in reality, although it's a psychological turning point, the men of Lord Lovat's 1st Commando Brigade actually just carry on going. They march over the Concanal Bridge, then the Orne River Bridge, and they reinforce the airborne troops who are holding the bridgehead on the other side of the Orne River, between the Orne and Dive River, as I mentioned before. The various high ground and bridges and various other key points there. So actually, they don't stay at the Concanal, but I think it's, as I say, it's the psychological thing about the link up between the first troops advancing inland. And although there's been a lot of pressure from the western side of these two bridges, that's the against the Concanal Bridge, it's really the pressure coming from the eastern side now that is going to concentrate both the 1st Commando Brigade and the 3rd and 5th Parachute brigades, for the rest of the day. But nevertheless, there is still fighting in and around the Concanal Bridge until the evening, when the 2nd Warwickshires arrive and 7 Para and Howard's men are finally and definitively relieved. So it's really a 24-hour job, not even that, I suppose. And by that point, their job is over.
How many men did they lose?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, if you look at 7 Para, let's take 7 Para first. I mean, they do most of the fighting because, as I've already hinted at, I mean, Howard's job is a very important job, but they carry it out quite effectively. It's the counterattacks that come in later on that incur most of the casualties for the Brits defending, and that's mainly 7 Para. They lose 3 officers and 16 men killed and 3 officers and 38 wounded. But if you think they only had 150 men in total, you can see those are quite serious casualties. That's about 40% casualties of the men defending the bridge. Howard, on the other hand, loses 5 officers, 1 killed, 2 wounded, and another 2 missing. Those 2 missing actually turn up later. They're the 2 guys on the missing glider. And 15 men wounded, and only 1 of those is killed. But the really sad story about D Company and Howard is that after this astonishing success and relatively light casualties, his whole battalion, because it's been reinforced with gliders landing during the evening of the 6th of June, his whole battalion is ordered the next day to capture the village of Escoville, which is, in this bridgehead or on the edge of this bridgehead that the airborne forces have created east of the River Orne. And what they don't realize is that elements of the 21st Panzer Division are already there, concealed and waiting. And his company and the rest of the battalion takes a hell of a beating. And so if you think that relatively few number were lost, in this famous action, the following day, his company loses 58 men, nearly half of its strength, killed, wounded, and missing. And Howard, really sadly, never really recovers from the sort of shock of this. He gets badly wounded that day. Actually, he's shot in the head, or at least in the helmet, and the bullet grazes his head. He's got a certain amount of blood loss and pretty serious concussion, and he's eventually evacuated to Britain, where he then gets involved in a serious car accident and never sees action again, very sadly for such a brilliant officer. But he is rewarded, or at least gets a little bit of a reward for his heroism on D-Day with the Distinguished Service Order. Could it have been a VC? I don't know. I mean, probably not a VC, because I don't think the personal risk to him was, ever that extreme, sort of VC standard, but certainly deserving of a DSO.
Do we know what happened to our brave man Thornton, the man with the Piat?
Yeah, Thornton, I think off the top of my head, he either gets a DSO or an MC. I mean, he's certainly rewarded and he's certainly survived. So of the other ranks that day, Thornton is the hero in the company, no question. He's one of those sort of quiet, determined NCOs who doesn't say much, but just leads by the front. Anyone who's got any military experience will understand that sort of character.
So it would have been if he was an NCO, it would have been a DCM or an MM, would it?
Yeah, sorry. It would either have been a DCM or an MM. You're absolutely right. Thank you for putting me straight on that. Quite right. I think it was the Distinguished Conduct Medal. But listeners can badger you with.
Well, I'm going to put links
details
in, because I know you've been talking a lot about bridges and rivers and beachheads. So I'm going to put a few links in the show notes for listeners if they want to have a look at that.
Yeah, but also I should say, I mean, it goes without saying, any book of this type, which ranges ranges far and wide as it does, of course, because I'm talking about airborne, not just at D-Day, but all over the history of the Second World War. They're all over the place. Maps are really important. So I was determined to get quite a few maps in this book. And HarperCollins, my publishers, were very good at indulging me. So there are some very good maps which will make it a lot easier to understand when you've got them in front of you when you're actually reading the book.
Well, this has been great, Saul. And I should mention, you just alluded to that. The book is not only talking about D-Day, it covers the airborne forces from, I think, February 42 through to March 45. Is that right?
Well, I mean, it's the story of their founding in June 1940, as I mentioned at the beginning of our chat, to the end of the war. And just to give you a very quick resume, just to, because some people may be aware of the D-Day story, but there are other actions that I've read and written a lot about the Second World War, as any of the listeners, I'm sure, know. But some of these stories I wasn't aware of. So I'm just going to give you a very, very brief resume of what else happened, the highlights, so to speak. The very, very first airborne operation was February 1941. So you could say that's when they first go into action. Operation Colossus, it was a plan to drop into southern Italy and blow up an aqueduct that was providing water for the whole province of Apulia. The idea is this is going to really, knock out the Italian war effort. I mean, it's a bit optimistic. But amazingly, the operation's a big success. They do manage to knock out this aqueduct. It doesn't quite have the effect they were hoping it would have, but it shows you that you can drop people behind the lines to carry out these missions and they can be successful. Only 36 guys involved.
They were SAS involved in that?
Well, no. Here's the really interesting thing. They were part of something called X-Troop Special Air Service Battalion, but that was not the SAS as we know it. That came later, and that, of course, was formed, as we know, in the desert. This was the name given, the sort of code name given to what becomes the 1st Parachute Battalion. So when I mentioned that the one of the commandos had parachute capability, that was 2nd Commando. That becomes the Special Air Service Battalion, and that later becomes the 1st Parachute Battalion. So that's the sort of the origins of the story. Then you have Operation Biting, which takes place in February 1942. That's when Major John Frost of Arnhem fame drops in with his company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion and captures part of the new Würzburg early warning radar system from Bruneval on the coast of France and brings it back to Britain. And that's a really key operation. And Max Hastings has written a whole book about that, which is coming out in May, I think, of this year. So, Ollie, you might want to have a chat with Max about that. Then there's Operation Freshman, which was an attempt to destroy heavy water in Norway. And this was a glider operation. That's November 1942. Total disaster. Everyone was either killed on impact, poor weather, faulty navigation. I mean, it's an absolute disaster. Both of the gliders crash. Those not killed on impact were captured and executed by the Germans, the first victims of the infamous Commando Order. So, really sad story, although it's got a happy ending because 3 months later, 6 Norwegian SOE operatives carry out what they were trying to do after parachuting into the country. And that, as I'm sure you know, Ollie, was immortalized later on by the British war film Heroes of Telemark, starring Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris. Then you've got Operation Market Garden. Well, I'm sure the listeners know about that. We mentioned it briefly. And finally, you could argue the single most successful airborne operation of the Second World War, certainly vying with the D-Day operation. And that's Operation Varsity, which is when US and British airborne forces jump the Rhine. Largest airborne operation in history in terms of the number on a single day. They land on the east bank of the Rhine near Wesel in North Germany to support an amphibious crossing by men of the British Second Army, and that's under the overall command of Montgomery. And what's significant about Varsity is they've learned all the lessons of Arnhem. They're dropped, the airborne troops are dropped in a single wave, which is why so many of them land in one day, as close to their objectives as possible. That was the other issue with Arnhem. And only after the ground troops were across the river. So that meaning the link up was going to happen within just a few hours, which is exactly what happens. But it was a textbook operation. There were heavy casualties, but they achieved their mission, link up with the ground forces. And as Eisenhower put it, it was the most successful airborne operation we carried out during the war.
Well, I hope we can talk about that as well in March next year.
There's a lot to come. There's a lot to come.
Yeah. Well, I think after the actual tragedy of Arnhem, it will be
It was nice to end the book on a high note, to be honest,
yeah.
Ollie, because I was aware that D-Day was pretty successful. I wasn't aware of quite how successful it was. I mean, just to wrap that up, every single objective that was given to the Airborne Division was achieved. I mean, it was a phenomenal success, and we should point out that bar some of those officers I mentioned, this was an untested division and caused, as I think I said, a lot of jealousy among First Airborne, who hadn't gone into action themselves as a whole division up to this point, and were very jealous that the 6th Airborne was given the opportunity to do that. They're kicking their heels, of course, until Arnhem, and we know how that turns out. So it was very nice to end with Operation Varsity, although isn't it interesting that the division that does that is 6th Airborne again? So was it a lucky star? Was it down to Gale? Was it partly, of course, because First Airborne was destroyed at Arnhem? Well, of course, that was a big factor too.
I'd imagine it's because First Airborne was wiped out pretty much, wasn't it?
Yeah, they did. They did reconstitute it. They were intending to use it later on in the war. It never actually goes into action again. It is slated to take place in a couple of operations in Germany. I mean, you wouldn't believe the list of airborne operations that are cancelled. So, although I've mentioned 5 or 6, it's unbelievable. I mean, before Arnhem, for example, from the D-Day landings to Arnhem, so from 6th Airborne Division landing on D-Day and Arnhem, there are, I think, 15 airborne operations that are planned and then cancelled. So, it was vanishingly unlikely that any of these operations were ever going to take place. And when Arnhem actually is, when they're told it's happening, none of them believe it. They think, well, it's just going to be cancelled. But of course it wasn't.
Right. Well, this has been wonderful, Saul. Thank you so much. Sky Warriors, a fantastic book. I recommend everyone goes out immediately to buy it. Saul, thank you.
Thanks, Ollie. Great talking to you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you can leave me a nice, gentle review, I'll be in your debt. But until then, thank you and good night.